in the vast expanses of Wyoming's Powder River Basin, where the wind carries whispers of forgotten histories and the earth holds secrets buried for generations. Marcus Hayes had been working the same 3,500 acres of prairie land for nearly 2 decades. The fourth-generation rancher had thought he knew every inch of his property, every creek bed, every rocky outcrop, every seasonal wildflower meadow that painted the landscape in brilliant colors each spring. But on a scorching July morning, in 2023, as Marcus guided his John Deere tractor across the eastern pasture, preparing for the summer hay harvest, the metal detector he'd mounted on his equipment began emitting a signal unlike anything he'd heard before. The steady, persistent beeping cut through the rumble of the diesel engine and the rhythmic swish of prairie grass against the machinery. Marcus had installed the metal detector 2 years earlier, after losing several valuable tools in the tall grass, but it had never detected anything more significant than old fence wire, discarded horseshoes, and the occasional beer can left by long-gone ranch hands. This signal, however, was different, deeper, more sustained, suggesting something substantial buried beneath the Wyoming soil. What Marcus would uncover that day would shake not only his understanding of his own land's history, but would bring federal investigators, historians, and journalists from across the country to his remote ranch. The discovery would reveal a truth so disturbing, so historically significant, that grown men would step back in horror, and the ripple effects would reach all the way to Washington, D.C. If you're ready to discover what was hidden in that rusted chest that made everyone back away in shock, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this discovery will change how you think about the hidden histories buried right beneath our feet. The CGNL Marcus Hayes wiped the sweat from his forehead as he shut off the tractor engine. The sudden silence of the Wyoming prairie, almost deafening after hours of mechanical noise. At 52, Marcus had the weathered hands and sun-creased face of a man who had spent his entire adult life working under the endless western sky. But his body still moved with the efficient strength of someone who understood that ranch work waited for no one. The metal detector's signal had been going off for nearly 10 minutes as he'd crisscrossed this particular section of the eastern pasture. He'd tried to ignore it initially, focused on finishing the day's mowing before the afternoon thunderstorms that were already building on the horizon. But the persistence of the signal, combined with its unusual depth and intensity, finally forced him to investigate. Probably just an old piece of farm equipment, Marcus muttered to himself as he climbed down from the tractor cab, his boots hitting the dried grass with a soft thud. But even as he spoke the words, something about the signal's characteristics nagged at him. In 2 years of using the detector, he'd learned to distinguish between different types of metal objects by the quality and duration of the beeping. This was something large, something that had been buried for a very long time. The July heat shimmered off the prairie in visible waves, and the nearest neighbor was over 8 miles away. Marcus's ranch sat in one of the most isolated parts of Wyoming, where cell phone coverage was spotty at best, and the closest town, Claremont, consisted of little more than a gas station, a diner, and about 200 residents. It was the kind of place where people minded their own business, and where secrets could stay buried for decades. Marcus walked to the back of his truck and retrieved his metal detector, a professional-grade Garrett ATX that he'd purchased after reading reviews from serious treasure hunters and archaeologists. He'd initially felt somewhat foolish spending that much money on what essentially amounted to an expensive toy, but it had already paid for itself by helping him locate lost tools and equipment. As he swept the detector over the area where the tractor-mounted unit had been signaling, the handheld device immediately began its own urgent chorus of beeps. Marcus adjusted the sensitivity and discrimination settings, trying to get a better read on whatever lay beneath the surface. The signal suggested a large metallic object buried approximately 4 feet down, deeper than any casual discard or lost tool would typically be found. The readings indicated ferrous metal, likely iron or steel, and the size estimates suggested something roughly the dimensions of a large toolbox or small trunk. 4 feet down, Marcus said aloud, his voice carrying across the empty grassland. Someone buried this thing on purpose. The realization sent a small chill down his spine despite the oppressive heat. In his 20 years of ranching this land, Marcus had occasionally found artifacts from the property's earlier inhabitants: old bottles, rusted horseshoes, fragments of pottery from the Lakota and Cheyenne tribes who had hunted these plains for centuries before white settlement. But those discoveries had always been surface finds or shallow burials, the natural result of time and weather exposing forgotten objects. Something buried 4 feet deep was intentional, Someone had taken considerable effort to ensure it stayed hidden. Marcus retrieved his shovel from the truck and began the laborious process of excavation. The Wyoming soil, baked hard by weeks of summer heat and minimal rainfall, resisted his efforts. Each shovelful required significant force, and within 20 minutes, his shirt was soaked with sweat as he dug. Marcus found himself thinking about the history of his land. The Hayes family had purchased the ranch in 1952 from a cattle company that had been struggling financially since the end of World War II. His grandfather, Robert Hayes, had paid cash for the property, part of the post-war boom that had allowed many returning servicemen to invest in Western land. But the property's history stretched back much further. According to county records, the land had been part of a larger homestead established in the 1880s by a German immigrant named Wilhelm Brenner. Brenner had arrived in Wyoming Territory as part of the wave of European settlement that followed the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, and he'd built a modest ranch house and barn in what was now the southern portion of Marcus's property. Brenner homestead had changed hands several times between 1890 and 1920, with various owners struggling to make the harsh Wyoming climate profitable for agriculture. During the 1930s, the property had been abandoned entirely, with the original buildings eventually collapsing and being reclaimed by the prairie. Marcus had explored the ruins of the Brenner homestead many times over the years, finding the foundation, stones and scattered debris fascinating glimpses into the lives of Wyoming's early settlers. But this burial site was nearly 2 miles from the original homestead location, in a section of prairie that showed no signs of historical habitation. After an hour of digging in the blazing sun, Marcus's shovel finally struck something solid, with a metallic clang that rang across the empty landscape. The sound was different from the dull thud of shovel against stone. This was clearly manufactured metal, and it was large. Marcus cleared away more soil, revealing the corner of what appeared to be a metal chest or trunk. The surface was heavily corroded, with decades of rust creating a rough, reddish-brown patina that flaked away at his touch. But beneath the corrosion, he could make out what had once been a sturdy construction. Thick metal walls held together, with heavy rivets in a style that suggested early to mid-20th century manufacturing. What the hell? Marcus breathed, his pulse quickening with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He expanded the excavation, working carefully around the perimeter of the buried object. The chest measured approximately 2 feet wide, 3 feet long, and 18 inches deep, large enough to contain significant contents, but small enough that 1 or 2 people could have buried it without heavy equipment. As more of the chest became visible, Marcus noticed details that increased his growing sense of unease. Heavy-duty hinges suggested this had been built to secure valuable or important contents. More disturbing were what appeared to be bullet holes in the metal surface. At least 3 distinct punctures that had penetrated the chest walls. The implications of those bullet holes made Marcus pause in his digging. Someone had shot at this chest, either before or after burial. That suggested violence, conflict, or at minimum, a desperate attempt to destroy or access whatever was inside. Marcus straightened up, his back aching from the prolonged digging, and surveyed the isolated prairie around him. The afternoon thunderstorms were building more rapidly now, with towering cumulus clouds creating dramatic shadows that raced across the grassland. He needed to make a decision quickly, either abandon the excavation and return later, or attempt to extract the chest before the weather arrived. But as he stood there in the Wyoming heat, with the wind beginning to pick up and carry the distant scent of rain, Marcus felt an overwhelming compulsion to see what lay inside that buried chest. 2 decades of ranching had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was telling him that this discovery was significant. "Let's see what you're hiding," he said to the rusted metal container, and began the process of freeing it completely from its earthen tomb. The final extraction required considerable effort. The chest was heavier than Marcus had anticipated, easily weighing over 100 pounds even after decades of burial. The metal handles had largely corroded away, forcing him to grip the chest itself, his hands coming away rust-stained and grimy. By the time he managed to wrestle the chest into the bed of his pickup truck, the first fat raindrops of the approaching storm were beginning to spatter against the heated metal. Marcus quickly gathered his tools and drove toward his ranch house, the mysterious chest sliding slightly in the truck bed with each bump and turn. As he pulled into his driveway, Marcus found himself hesitating before getting out of the truck. Whatever was in that chest had been deliberately buried, deliberately hidden, and deliberately shot. Someone had gone to considerable lengths to ensure it stayed secret, but it was too late to turn back now. The chest sat in his truck bed like a silent accusation, demanding to reveal the secrets it had protected for decades beneath the Wyoming soil. And Marcus Hayes, despite a growing sense of foreboding, knew he was going to open it. The OP&AG, the storm that had been threatening all afternoon, finally arrived with the sudden violence typical of Wyoming weather, turning the ranch yard into a muddy chaos of wind-driven rain and marble-sized hail. Marcus managed to drag the rusted chest from his truck bed to the covered workshop behind his house just as the worst of the weather hit, the metal container leaving rust stains on his concrete floor. Inside the workshop, surrounded by the familiar smells of motor oil, leather, and wood shavings, Marcus felt somewhat more secure as he examined his discovery under the harsh fluorescent lights. The chest looked even more ominous indoors, its corroded surface and bullet holes creating an atmosphere of menace that seemed almost alive in the confined space. Marcus's workshop had always been his sanctuary, the place where he repaired equipment, crafted leather goods as a hobby, and occasionally retreated when the isolation of ranch life became overwhelming. The walls were lined with tools accumulated over 2 decades, some inherited from his father and grandfather, others purchased for specific projects that had seemed urgent at the time. Now, faced with this mysterious chest, Marcus found himself wishing he had someone to share the moment with. His wife, Jennifer, had died 3 years earlier from cancer, and their only child, a daughter named Sarah, lived in Denver and visited perhaps twice a year. The ranch hands he employed were seasonal workers who came and went with the cattle drives and hay harvests. And Marcus had deliberately maintained professional rather than personal relationships with them. The isolation that had once felt like independence now felt like vulnerability as he stared at the bullet-riddled chest. Marcus circled the container slowly, examining every detail under the bright lights. The construction was definitely professional, not a homemade project, but something manufactured for durability and security. The metal appeared to be steel, with reinforcing ribs that had helped it survive decades of burial. The lock mechanism had corroded beyond function, but the hasp remained stubbornly closed, held by rust and time rather than any functioning security device. The bullet holes were what drew his attention most insistently. 3 distinct punctures, each roughly .45 caliber, based on Marcus's experience with firearms. 2 had penetrated the front panel, while the third had struck near the right side hinge. The angles suggested the shots had been fired from close range, almost execution-style positioning. Someone really didn't want this thing opened, Marcus muttered, running his finger along the edge of one bullet hole. The metal around each puncture showed signs of impact trauma, the kind of damage that occurred when high-velocity rounds struck solid barriers, using a combination of penetrating oil, heat from a propane torch, and brute force applied through a large pry bar. Marcus spent nearly 2 hours working to free the corroded latch mechanism. The storm outside provided a dramatic soundtrack to his efforts, with thunder rolling across the prairie and rain drumming against the workshop's metal roof. Finally, with a grinding shriek of protest that seemed to echo with decades of buried secrets, the chest's lid broke free and swung open on protesting hinges. The smell hit him immediately, not the expected odor of decay or mold, but something metallic and sharp that made his eyes water and forced him to step back. It was the smell of old blood mixed with rust and something chemical that he couldn't identify. Marcus grabbed a flashlight and approached the open chest cautiously, his heart pounding with an anxiety that seemed disproportionate to the situation. But as the flashlight beam illuminated the contents, he understood why his subconscious had been warning him. The chest contained horrors. Photographs, dozens of black and white photographs, some loose, others bound in deteriorating folders. The images that were visible face-up showed scenes of violence, so graphic and disturbing that Marcus immediately understood why someone had tried to destroy this container with gunfire. Beneath the photographs were documents, official papers with letterheads he couldn't immediately make out, handwritten notes in what appeared to be German, and what looked like military records or reports. Some of the papers bore official seals and stamps, suggesting government or military origin. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in what had once been oiled cloth, was a collection of personal items that made Marcus's blood run cold. Jewelry, wedding rings, watches, necklaces, but also more disturbing artifacts. Gold dental work, eyeglasses, children's toys, and human hair. Braided locks of human hair in various colors, each tied with ribbon and labeled with handwritten tags that Marcus couldn't read in the dim light. Marcus stepped back from the open chest, his hands shaking as the full implications of the discovery began to settle in his mind. This wasn't some family heirloom or buried treasure. This was evidence of atrocities, carefully preserved and hidden by someone who had understood their significance. The photographs he could see showed scenes of systematic violence, groups of people in what appeared to be prison uniforms, military personnel overseeing mass graves, close-up images of individual victims that were too graphic for Marcus to examine closely. The clinical nature of the documentation suggested these weren't random acts of violence, but organized, systematic crimes. Marcus's first instinct was to close the chest immediately and pretend he'd never found it. This was clearly something beyond his understanding or ability to handle, something that belonged in the hands of law enforcement or historians who were trained to deal with such materials. But as he reached for the lid, a loose photograph caught his attention. Unlike the others, this one showed not violence, but what appeared to be a group portrait of men in military uniforms. The uniforms were wrong, though not American military, but something European, with insignia and styling that looked distinctly German. Marcus picked up the photograph carefully, using a clean shop rag to avoid direct contact. The image showed approximately 15 men posed in front of what appeared to be a wooden building. Some wore military uniforms, others civilian clothes, but all had the confident bearing of people in positions of authority. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in faded ink, "Project Heimkehr, Wyoming, 1947. Neue Identitäten, Neue Lab." Marcus didn't speak German, but he recognized the reference to Wyoming and the date, 1947, just 5 years before his grandfather had purchased the ranch. With growing dread, Marcus began to realize that his family's land might have harbored secrets far darker than he had ever imagined. The chest wasn't just evidence of historical atrocities, it was evidence of atrocities that had somehow been connected to this specific piece of Wyoming. Prairie. As thunder continued to roll across the darkening sky and rain hammered against the workshop walls, Marcus found himself facing a decision that would change his life forever. He could rebury the chest and try to forget what he'd seen, or he could open it fully and confront whatever truth it contained. But even as he wrestled with the decision, Marcus knew there was really no choice. The chest had been hidden for over 70 years, and its secrets had literally come to light on his watch. Whatever horrors it contained, whatever truth it represented, he was now responsible for ensuring that truth was revealed. With hands that trembled despite his efforts to control them, Marcus began the process of carefully examining the chest's contents, documenting each item with his phone camera before handling it. What he discovered would not only horrify him personally, but would ultimately lead to one of the most significant historical revelations in Wyoming's modern history. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if the very earth was protesting the exposure of secrets it had kept buried for so long. The airy Violation Marcus Hayes had always prided himself on being a practical man, someone who dealt with problems directly and efficiently. 30 years of ranch life had taught him to handle crises, ranging from injured livestock to equipment failures to severe weather emergencies. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the contents of the rusted chest, now spread across his workshop table. After 3 hours of careful documentation and examination, the full scope of the horror had become clear. The chest contained evidence of Nazi war crimes, but more disturbing still, it documented the presence of Nazi war criminals who had somehow made their way to Wyoming in the years immediately following World War II. The photographs were the most damning evidence. Image after image showed systematic murder, torture, and medical experimentation carried out with the clinical precision of people who viewed their victims as less than human. Many of the photographs bore stamps and notations in German, suggesting they had been official documentation of atrocities committed at concentration camps and other Nazi facilities. But it was the documents that revealed the most shocking truth. Among the German papers, Marcus had found several in English correspondence between individuals with American names discussing Operation Paperclip subjects and Reich citizenship transfers. The letters referenced Project Heimkehr, which Marcus's high school German was sufficient to translate as Project Homecoming. One document, bearing the letterhead of what appeared to be a U.S. government agency Marcus didn't recognize, outlined procedures for asset relocation and identity establishment for high-value German scientific personnel. The clinical language couldn't disguise what appeared to be an official program for bringing Nazi war criminals to American soil and providing them with new identities. Marcus's hands shook as he photographed each document with his phone, knowing instinctively that he was documenting something of immense historical significance. The implications were staggering, not just that Nazi war criminals had reached Wyoming, but that they had apparently done so with the knowledge and assistance of U.S. government agencies. The personal effects in the chest told an even more disturbing story. The jewelry, dental work, and other items were clearly victims' possessions, trophies taken by people who viewed mass murder as a collector's hobby. Each item had been carefully catalogued, with notations in German that suggested they represented specific individuals or events. Most disturbing of all were the braided locks of human hair, each tied with ribbon and labeled with what appeared to be names, dates, and locations. Marcus counted 37 separate samples, ranging from the white hair of elderly victims to the golden curls of children. The meticulous preservation suggested someone who took pride in documenting their crimes. As the storm outside began to subside, Marcus realized he was facing a decision that would affect not only his own life, but potentially rewrite the historical record of post-war America. The evidence in the chest suggested that his ranch, his family's land, had somehow been connected to a network that had harbored Nazi war criminals in the American West. Marcus walked to his kitchen and poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon, his mind racing through the implications. If he reported this discovery, it would bring federal investigators, historians, journalists, and possibly international attention to his quiet ranch. His privacy, his peaceful existence, would be destroyed forever. But if he didn't report it, he would become complicit in covering up evidence of some of the worst crimes in human history. The decision was made easier by a discovery he made when examining the chest more carefully under magnification. Scratched into the inner lid of the container, barely visible beneath decades of corrosion, was a message in English. God forgive me for what I have done. May this evidence someday bring justice to the innocent. WB 1953, WB Wilhelm Brenner, the German immigrant who had originally homesteaded this land. Marcus spent the rest of the night researching Wilhelm Brenner online, using his satellite internet connection to dig through historical records and immigration databases. What he found painted a picture that both horrified and amazed him. Wilhelm Brenner had indeed immigrated to Wyoming Territory in the 1880s. But according to Ellis Island records, he had been fleeing Germany not for economic opportunity, but as a political refugee. Brenner had been involved with early social democratic movements that opposed the militaristic tendencies of the German Empire. More significantly, Brenner had a son, Friedrich, who had remained in Germany and had apparently become involved with the Nazi Party during the 1930s. Immigration records showed that Friedrich Brenner had entered the United States in 1946, claiming to be a refugee from Soviet-occupied Germany, but the evidence in the chest suggested that Friedrich Brenner had been something far more sinister than a refugee. The correspondence Marcus had found included several letters signed FB that discussed maintaining operational security and protecting valuable assets in language that suggested military or intelligence training. Cross-referencing the dates in the documents with historical records, Marcus began to piece together a horrifying picture. It appeared that Friedrich Brenner had been part of a network of Nazi war criminals who had been secretly brought to the United States, possibly as part of classified programs designed to exploit German scientific and intelligence knowledge for Cold War purposes. The Wyoming ranch, isolated and far from major population centers, had apparently served as a temporary safe house or meeting place for these relocated Nazis. The buried chest represented either insurance against betrayal, evidence that could expose the entire network, or the guilty conscience of Wilhelm Brenner, who had discovered what his son had become. By dawn, Marcus had made his decision. He called the FBI field office in Cheyenne, and after being transferred through several departments, finally reached Special Agent Maria Santos, who specialized in historical war crimes and international fugitive cases. "Mr. Hayes," Agent Santos said after Marcus had given her a preliminary description of his discovery, "I need you to understand that what you're describing could be evidence in ongoing international war crimes investigations. We're going to need to secure that site immediately." Within 6 hours, Marcus's isolated ranch had been transformed into a major crime scene. FBI agents, historians from the Holocaust Memorial Museum, representatives from the Department of Justice's Office of Special Investigations, and international observers from Germany and Israel had all descended on the property. Dr. Rebecca Goldstein, a historian specializing in Nazi war crimes, was among the first experts to examine the chest's contents. Her reaction was immediate and emotional. "My God," she whispered as she reviewed the photographs, tears streaming down her face. "Some of these images, we've been looking for this documentation for decades. These photographs show atrocities at camps we could never prove existed. Agent Santos coordinated the investigation with professional efficiency, but Marcus could see the horror in her eyes as she processed each piece of evidence. "Mr. Hayes," she told him privately, "this discovery is going to rewrite the history books. We always suspected that more Nazi war criminals had reached American soil than we could prove. But this is the first concrete evidence of an organized network operating in the American West." The investigation that followed would last for months, ultimately leading to the identification of at least 12 Nazi war criminals who had lived and died in the United States under assumed identities. Some had established successful businesses, raised families, and become respected members of their communities, all while carrying the knowledge of unspeakable crimes. But perhaps most significantly, the discovery led to the identification and recovery of remains from a mass grave located on a neighboring property, the final resting place of refugees and concentration camp survivors, who had been murdered after the war by the very people who should have been brought to justice. As Marcus watched the teams of investigators working across his land, he realized that his quiet ranch would never be the same. But he also understood that some discoveries are too important to keep buried, no matter the personal cost. The rusted chest had held secrets that demanded to be told, truths that belonged to history rather than to the Wyoming soil. And Marcus Hayes, a simple rancher who had been looking for nothing more than lost tools, had become the instrument through which justice, delayed by over 7 decades, could finally begin to be served. The FTRMATI checks. Months after Marcus Hayes pulled that rusted chest from his Wyoming prairie, the world had changed in ways he never could have anticipated. What began as a routine day of hay preparation had evolved into one of the most significant Nazi war crimes discoveries in American history, with implications that reached from rural Wyoming to the halls of international justice. The FBI investigation, led by Special Agent Maria Santos, had expanded far beyond Marcus's ranch. Using the documents and correspondence found in Wilhelm Brenner's chest as a roadmap, investigators had traced connections across 17 states, identifying a network of Nazi war criminals who had lived hidden lives in American communities for decades. Operation Heimkehr, as the Nazi program had been called, had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The program had successfully relocated over 200 Nazi war criminals to the United States between 1945 and 1955, providing them with new identities, financial support, and secure locations where they could live without fear of prosecution. Dr. Rebecca Goldstein, who had become the lead historian documenting the discovery, explained the significance to Marcus during one of her regular visits to the ranch. "What you found, Marcus, is not just evidence of war crimes. It's proof of systematic betrayal of everything America claimed to stand for after World War II. While we were prosecuting Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg, other branches of our own government were secretly harboring their colleagues. The personal effects found in the chest had led to even more heartbreaking discoveries. Each lock of hair, each piece of jewelry, each personal item had been carefully catalogued and cross-referenced with Holocaust victim databases. The meticulous German record-keeping that had documented the murders also enabled investigators to identify many of the victims and contact surviving family members. Sarah Goldstein, a 73-year-old Holocaust survivor living in New York, received a phone call in December that she had never expected. Her younger sister Ruth, murdered at Treblinka concentration camp in 1943, had been identified through a lock of hair found in the Wyoming chest. "For 80 years, I wondered what happened to her," Sarah told Marcus when she visited the ranch, to see where her sister's memory had been preserved. "I never had a grave to visit, never had proof of what they did to her. This chest, this terrible evidence, it gave me back my sister's story." The mass grave discovered on the neighboring property had yielded the remains of 47 individuals, men, women, and children, who had been murdered sometime between 1947 and 1952. Forensic analysis suggested they had been concentration camp survivors, who had somehow learned about the Nazi network in Wyoming and had been killed to protect the secret. Marcus found himself at the center of media attention he had never wanted and still struggled to handle. Documentary crews, journalists, and authors arrived at his ranch regularly, all seeking to understand how such horrors could have remained hidden in the American heartland for so long. "I'm not a hero," Marcus repeatedly told reporters. "I just found something that needed to be found. If anyone's a hero, it's Wilhelm Brenner. He's the one who preserved the evidence, who made sure the truth would eventually come out." The investigation had revealed Wilhelm Brenner's tragic story in full, The German immigrant had discovered his son Friedrich's true identity and crimes in 1952. Shortly after Friedrich's arrival in Wyoming, Wilhelm had confronted his son, leading to a violent altercation that resulted in Friedrich's death and Wilhelm's decision to bury the evidence of the Nazi network's activities. Wilhelm had lived with the burden of that knowledge until his own death in 1960, leaving behind only the scratched message in the chest lid and a detailed journal hidden in his abandoned homestead that investigators eventually discovered. The journal, written in a mixture of German and English, provided a first-hand account of a father's horror at discovering his son's monstrous crimes, and his struggle to decide whether to expose the entire network or protect other innocent German immigrants who might be persecuted by association. "My son is dead by my own hand," Wilhelm had written in his final journal entry. "God forgive me, but I could not let him continue to live free while his victims lie in unmarked graves. I have buried the evidence of their crimes, but I pray that, someday, someone will find it and bring justice to those who were silenced." Agent Santos coordinated with international law enforcement agencies to pursue the few surviving members of the Nazi network. 3 individuals, all in their late 90s, were identified and arrested in different parts of the United States. Their trials, expected to begin in 2024, would represent some of the last opportunities to bring Nazi war criminals to justice. The discovery also led to significant changes in how the U.S. government handled historical war crimes cases. The Department of Justice announced the creation of a new task force dedicated to investigating other classified programs that might have harbored war criminals. And Congress launched hearings into the extent of government complicity in protecting Nazi fugitives. For Marcus, the most significant change was personal. The isolation he had once cherished was gone forever, replaced by a constant stream of visitors, investigators, and pilgrims who came to see the site where such an important historical discovery had been made. But he had also gained something unexpected, a sense of purpose that extended far beyond the daily routines of ranch life. The Hayes Ranch had become an unofficial memorial site, with families of Holocaust victims traveling from around the world to pay their respects at the place where their loved ones' stories had finally been told. Marcus worked with Dr. Goldstein and several Holocaust memorial organizations to establish a permanent memorial on the site where the mass grave had been discovered. The memorial, dedicated in spring of 2024, bore the names of all 47 victims whose remains had been recovered, along with the inscription, "In memory of those who were silenced, and in gratitude to those who preserved their voices." On the anniversary of his discovery, Marcus stood in his workshop looking at the empty space, where the rusted chest had sat for those first few hours after he'd brought it inside. The chest itself was now in the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., where it served as centerpiece of an exhibition about Nazi war criminals in America. Dr. Goldstein had visited the ranch that morning, bringing with her copies of letters from survivors and family members around the world who had been touched by the discovery. Many expressed gratitude, not just for the historical revelations, but for the proof that evil, no matter how carefully hidden, could not remain buried forever. "You know," Dr. Goldstein told Marcus, as they stood together watching the sunset over the prairie, "Wilhelm Brenner was right to trust that someone would eventually find what he buried. But I don't think even he could have imagined that it would be someone like you. Someone who would make sure the truth was told, no matter what it cost." Personally, Marcus nodded, thinking about the price of the discovery. His quiet life was gone, his privacy destroyed, his peaceful existence replaced by constant reminders of humanity's capacity for evil. But he had also witnessed humanity's capacity for justice, compassion, and the stubborn refusal to let truth remain buried. "I think about those victims sometimes," Marcus said quietly. "How they died so far from home, probably believing that no one would ever know what happened to them. At least now, their families know. At least now, their stories are part of the record." As winter settled over the Wyoming prairie, Marcus continued his ranch work, but with a new understanding of the land beneath his feet. Every acre of his property now carried the weight of history. Every sunrise reminded him that some discoveries changed not just individual lives, but the world's understanding of truth and justice. The rusted chest had contained horrors that had remained hidden for over 70 years, but it had also contained something equally powerful: the evidence that no crime, no matter how carefully concealed or officially protected, could remain hidden forever when ordinary people chose to confront difficult truths. Marcus Hayes, a simple rancher who had been looking for nothing more than lost tools, had instead found proof that justice, though delayed, could still be served. And in doing so, he had helped ensure that the voices of the silenced would finally be heard, their stories finally told, and their memory finally honored. This incredible discovery reminds us that history's darkest secrets can be hiding right beneath our feet, and that ordinary people can become the instruments of extraordinary justice. Marcus's courage to report what he found, despite the personal cost, helped bring closure to families who had waited 8 decades for answers. If this story moved you, share it to honor the memory of those whose voices were finally heard, and subscribe for more true stories that prove truth will always find a way to surface. Remember, sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones we're not looking for, but they find us exactly when the world needs them most.